The dust of old Earth was a sin. That was the first lesson the Cathar taught us after they arrived. Not in warships, but in vessels that looked like polished river stones, silent and impossibly smooth. They didn't come to conquer, they came to curate. Humanity, they explained in voices that sounded like chimes in a vacuum, was a masterpiece of cosmic potential, tragically flawed and spattered with the grime of its own chaotic history. They were here to save us from ourselves, to gently wipe away the blood and the tears, to sand down the jagged edges of our souls until we were as smooth and serene as their ships. They took our planet, our governments, and our art, and gave us sanctuary in return. We traded Earth for Mars, a world remade in their image of tranquil perfection, and we were told to be grateful. My name is Elara, and my job was to help them erase the memory of the trade. I was a scribe, a privileged position in the gleaming ivory spire that pierced the thin, rust-colored sky of Sanctuary. Below me, the city fanned out in concentric circles of pristine parks, placid canals, and harmonious architecture. A city where no one ever raised their voice, where contentment was not a goal but a baseline state of being. It was enforced by the symbiote, a microscopic silver filament woven into the brainstem of every human at birth. It was the Cathar's greatest gift, the cure for our inherent sickness. The symbiote filtered our emotions, smoothing the violent peaks of rage and the crushing depths of despair into a gentle, manageable hum. It rewarded compliance with a soft, warm glow behind the eyes, a whisper of pleasure for a task well done, a thought that aligned with the Cathar's doctrine of universal harmony. We were caged not by bars, but by bliss. My work consisted of processing the remnants of Earth's culture books, poems, songs, journals, and redacting them for the Grand Archive. I spent my days in a sterile white cubicle, bathed in the soft light of a data slate, carefully excising passages that celebrated rebellion, glorified passion, or lingered too long on the messy, unpredictable nature of human feeling. I was a janitor of history, sweeping up the inconvenient truths and leaving behind a hollowed-out, sanitized version of what we once were. My overseer, a Cathar named Xylos, would often glide into my cubicle, his tall, slender form casting no shadow. Like all Cathar, he was a being of unsettling grace, with skin like polished alabaster and large, liquid black eyes that held a look of profound, paternalistic pity. Meticulous work. Scribe Elara. He would chime, his voice resonating directly in my mind. A common trait of their species. He would gesture with a three-fingered hand towards a line of poetry I had flagged for removal. You see how the primitive mind equated suffering with beauty, a dangerous pathology. You do a great service by pruning these weeds. I would feel the warm glow of the symbiote affirming his praise, and I would incline my head in thanks, a placid smile on my face, while a part of me I could barely access screamed in a silent, soundproofed room deep inside my skull. It was on a Tuesday, while sifting through a collection of pre-contact verse from a forgotten poet, that I found the anomaly. Buried beneath a simple sonnet about winter was a palimpsest, a ghost of data hidden in the file's substrata. It was an old technique, something my training had taught me to identify as digital vandalism, a flaw to be wiped clean. But curiosity, a flicker of emotion the symbiote hadn't quite managed to extinguish, made me pause. For 3 days, I worked on it in secret after my allotted hours, my heart producing a strange, unfamiliar rhythm that was neither pleasure nor pain. I peeled back the layers of code, navigating the digital labyrinth left by some long-dead dissident. What I found wasn't a manifesto or a battle plan. It was a waveform, a complex sequence of light and sound frequencies accompanied by a single, cryptic phrase. The key is not a word, but the silence between the notes. It meant nothing to me, yet I couldn't discard it. The pattern felt alive, a coiled serpent of potential energy sleeping in my data slate. I stored it in a hidden partition, a tiny act of rebellion that felt as monumental as starting a war. The next morning, Ren, a junior scribe from the cubicle across the aisle, showed me what he had done. His eyes, usually as placid as everyone else's, held a spark of something wild. He had been processing zoological texts and, on a whim, had sketched one of the extinct creatures on a spare slate. It was a bird, a falcon, rendered with startling life and precision from memory and anatomical diagrams, an act of pure, unprompted creation. It was beautiful, and it was a crime. The Cathar encouraged art, but only their art geometric, abstract, devoid of messy representation or historical context. To remember and recreate something from the chaotic past was an act of regression. "Isn't it magnificent?" Ren whispered, the symbiote in his mind clearly struggling to dampen his pride. "They say its eyes could see a mouse from a mile away." I felt a cold dread creep past my own filter. "You should delete this." Ren. Immediately. But it was too late. Xylos glided behind him, his presence sucking the warmth from the air. He looked at the drawing, his black eyes unblinking. The chimes in my head were soft, almost sorrowful. A fascinating artifact of a predatory past. Scribe Ren, but your function is to preserve harmony, not to resurrect chaos. Your emotional spectrum appears unbalanced. A recalibration is in order. They took him not to a prison, but to a wellness nexus. I watched on a security feed, a privilege of my senior rank. There was no violence. Ren sat in a comfortable chair as a Cathar technician applied a device to his temple. There was a soft hum, a flash of pale blue light. When it was over, Ren stood up. He looked at the Cathar and smiled a perfect, serene, empty smile. The spark in his eyes was gone, replaced by the placid glow of total compliance. They showed him the falcon drawing again, and he simply tilted his head. "An inefficient design," he commented, his voice flat, prone to asymmetrical flight patterns. They had not just punished him, they had hollowed him out, scooped out the part of him that dreamed of falcons, and left behind a polite, functional automaton. In that moment, watching the ghost of a boy thank his lobotomist, the silent scream inside me finally broke through its cage. The grief and the rage were so potent that the symbiote flared in my brainstem, a spike of sharp, cloying pleasure meant to pacify me. But it was like trying to douse a chemical fire with a cup of water. It only made the burning worse. That night, the memory of Ren's empty eyes and the waveform on my slate merged in my mind. The silence between the notes. A disruption. A key. A way to break the circuit. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that the frequency I had discovered was a weapon. Not a weapon of destruction, but of awakening. I had to know if it worked. I had to see for myself what would happen if the song of the symbiote was, for even a moment, silenced. My plan was desperate and crude. Using my scribe clearance, I began to requisition components from the Spire's maintenance division, a micro-resonator, a signal amplifier, a portable power cell. I disguised the requests as diagnostic upgrades for my archival equipment. Each new component felt like a stone laid on a path leading off a cliff. My journey took me down, deeper into the Spire than I had ever been. The pristine white corridors of the upper levels gave way to brushed metal, then to raw, unadorned concrete. The soft, harmonious chimes of the public spaces were replaced by the hum of massive air recyclers and the clank of service drones. Here, the humans were different. Their faces were still placid, but their movements were quicker, more functional. They were the engineers, the sanitation workers, the ones who kept the beautiful illusion of sanctuary running. They glanced at me, a high-level scribe in their domain, with faint, untroubled curiosity before returning to their tasks. They were still caged, but their bars felt closer, the gilding worn thin by toil. I assembled the device in a cramped service conduit, my fingers clumsy, my mind racing. It was an ugly thing, a tangle of wires and circuits stuffed into a small casing. But when I powered it on, it emitted a low, almost subsonic hum. It was ready. My target was Meridian Plaza, the central gathering point of my city sector, where hundreds of off-duty humans would be enjoying their mandated leisure period, sitting by fountains and admiring holographic sculptures under the simulated twilight of the dome. I concealed the device in a discarded maintenance kit and made my way back to the upper levels, my symbiote flooding my system with anxious pleasure, trying desperately to soothe the storm in my mind. I walked through the plaza, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The faces around me were a sea of calm, pleasant smiles. Friends chatted with soft, moderated voices. Children played without shouting. It was the picture of peace. It was the very definition of hell. I found a spot near the central fountain, tucked the device behind a planner, and keyed the activation sequence on my slate. I set the broadcast radius to 50 meters and the duration to 5 seconds. I didn't want to riot. I just wanted to see their eyes. I pressed the command. For a heartbeat. Nothing happened. Then the hum from the device pulsed outward, silent and invisible. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The man closest to me, who had been admiring a flower, suddenly dropped it, his placid expression shattering like glass. His face contorted, not with rage, but with a look of profound, soul-crushing grief. A raw, animal sob tore from his throat. A woman nearby gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror so pure it was paralyzing. Across the plaza, the chain reaction spread. The placid masks fell away, revealing the raw, unfiltered humanity that had been suppressed for generations. It wasn't just rage and fear. It was confusion, sorrow, longing, shock, a tidal wave of unprocessed emotion hitting them all at once. A man clenched his fists, his knuckles white, staring at his own hands as if he'd never seen them before. Another simply fell to his knees and wept, his cries echoing in the sudden, terrible silence that had fallen over the plaza. It lasted only 5 seconds. Then the device powered down, and the familiar, warm hum of the symbiote rushed back in to fill the vacuum. The wave of raw feeling vanished as quickly as it had come. The sobbing man blinked, a look of bewilderment on his face, before a gentle smile returned. The terrified woman straightened her tunic, her expression once again serene. But I had seen it. They had seen it. For a fleeting moment, they had been awake. The response was immediate. Cathar peacekeepers, elegant, armored constructs of metal and purpose, descended into the plaza. They moved with silent efficiency, their weapons emitting soft pulses of light that deepened the compliant state of the panicked citizens, guiding them away from the area. Alarms, gentle but insistent, began to chime throughout the spire. My slate identified me as the source of the rogue frequency. I was no longer a scribe. I was a contagion. As the peacekeepers turned their blank, insect-like heads in my direction, I didn't wait. I spun around and ran. Not toward my home, but back toward the darkness, toward the grimy service levels that were my only escape. I plunged into a maintenance hatch just as a pulse of pacification energy washed over the spot where I had been standing. I was alone in the dark, my breath ragged, the screams and sobs of the plaza still ringing in my ears. I had lit a match in a mausoleum. I hadn't freed anyone, not yet. But I had proven that the ghosts inside us were not dead, merely sleeping. And I had a key that could wake them. My only path now led down, away from the false sky of sanctuary, and out into the forgotten red wastes where the other broken things, the other weeds, had been sent to die. The darkness of the service levels was a living thing, thick with the smell of ozone, recycled air, and the faint metallic scent of decay. The soft chimes of the spire were gone, replaced by the groaning of ancient machinery and the drip of condensation on corroded pipes. My scribe's robes were a liability, their white fabric a beacon in the gloom. I tore a strip from the hem to tie back my hair, the unfamiliar roughness of the material scraping my skin. The symbiote in my head was a frantic, terrified thing. It pulsed with waves of calming pleasure, trying to convince me that everything was fine, that the Cathar peacekeepers methodically sweeping the levels above were a figment of an unbalanced mind, that my place was back in my cubicle, redacting the past. The pleasure felt like acid, a sweet poison telling me to lie down and wait for the end. I fought it, focusing on the memory of Ren's empty eyes, using the sharp edge of my rage as an anchor in the storm of enforced serenity. I was a creature of data and logic, completely lost in this physical labyrinth. Every corridor looked the same, a spine of pipes and conduits branching off into darkness. I stumbled on for what felt like hours, my pursuers a distant, rhythmic thudding that seemed to be getting closer. It was a flicker of illicit light from a half-open doorway that saved me. It wasn't the clean, white light of the spire, but a dirty yellow glow, sputtering and alive. I slipped inside, my back pressing against the cold metal door as a peacekeeper patrol glided past the opening, its multifaceted head sweeping the corridor with beams of analytical light. The room was a hoarder's paradise, a chaotic nest of scavenged technology. Stripped-down service drones lay in pieces on workbenches, spools of fiber optic cable coiled like sleeping serpents. In the center of the room, a man was hunched over a jury-rigged console, his face illuminated by the flickering screen. He was younger than I'd expected, with grease smudged on his jaw and eyes that were sharp and restless. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He just slowly turned his head, a tool clutched in his hand like a weapon. "You're a long way from the sky, scribe," he said, his voice a low rasp, devoid of the engineered placidity I was used to. It was the first unfiltered human voice I had heard in years. "They're hunting you. The whole network is screaming about a rogue frequency broadcast in Meridian Plaza. That was you." It wasn't a question. I clutched the maintenance kit containing my device, my only bargaining chip. "I need to get out of the spire." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Everyone wants out. There is no out. There's just here. And the rust. And you won't last 5 minutes in the rust." "Take me there," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I can pay you." He raised an eyebrow, his gaze sweeping over my pristine robes. "With what recitations of redacted poetry I have clearance codes," I said, the words tumbling out. "Master-level scribe access to archival systems, maintenance schedules, energy grid schematics, things you could use, things you could sell." That got his attention. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of calculation in their depths. He was a creature of this underworld, a scavenger who lived in the cracks of the Cathar's perfect system. He knew the value of information. "My name is Kyle," he said, setting down his tool. "And you're going to cost me a lot of trouble. The codes better be worth it." Our journey down was a descent into history. Kyle moved through the service levels with an ingrained familiarity. A rat in the walls of a palace. He led me through ducts barely wide enough to crawl through, across catwalks suspended over cavernous, humming power cores, and into forgotten sub-basements where the original Martian rock bled through the concrete, cold and red. This was the spire's true foundation, built on secrets and grime. We saw the other inhabitants of the deep, the ones who, like Kale, had carved out an existence in the shadows. They were furtive and silent, their faces smudged with dirt, their symbiotes either malfunctioning or expertly bypassed, leaving their expressions guarded and raw. They traded scavenged parts and contraband nutrients in hushed tones, their eyes constantly scanning the darkness for the telltale blue glow of a peacekeeper patrol. They were ghosts in the machine. And they looked at me with a mixture of fear and contempt. I was one of the pampered ones from above, a tourist in their purgatory. To them, my clean hands were as alien as a Cathar's three-fingered ones. Kale explained that the Cathar tolerated this underbelly as a necessary evil. It was an unofficial dumping ground for those who didn't quite fit the mold of sanctuary but weren't disruptive enough for recalibration. They were the system's rounding error, and as long as they kept the machinery running, they were left alone. "They don't care what we do down here," Kyle muttered as we shimmied past a leaking coolant pipe. "As long as the lights stay on upstairs." He had a vehicle, a monstrosity he called a skidder. It was the skeleton of a four-legged maintenance drone, retrofitted with a cramped cockpit, stripped-down plating, and oversized treads instead of legs. It was ugly, loud, and my only hope. He kept it hidden in a decommissioned waste ejection chamber at the very base of the spire, a place that reeked of industrial chemicals and finality. Getting it out was our first true test. Using the codes I provided, Kale sliced into the spire's archaic disposal systems, tricking the network into thinking a scheduled purge was imminent. As klaxons blared and massive bay doors groaned open, revealing the blood-red landscape of Mars for the first time, my symbiote screamed. It flooded my senses with the comforting illusion of my cubicle, the smell of sanitized air, the soft glow of my data slate. It was a desperate attempt to pull me back from the brink of this terrible, chaotic freedom. I grit my teeth. the pleasure so intense it was agonizing, and focused on Kyle's shouted instructions as he hot-wired the skitter's engine. We shot out of the disposal chute like a metal coffin, landing hard on the dusty plains outside. Kyle gunned the engine, and the skitter lurched forward, leaving the ivory spire dwindling in our wake, a serene, white needle stabbing a sky the color of dried blood. The world outside the dome was breathtaking and terrifying. The raw, untamed planet stretched to a horizon of jagged canyons and wind-scoured mesas. The thin atmosphere made the stars seem impossibly bright and close, cold diamonds scattered on black velvet. There was no birdsong, no gentle breeze, just the howl of the wind and the crunch of iron-rich soil under our treads. It was a world of profound and beautiful silence, a silence the Cathar had tried to fill with their harmonious chimes and placid contentment. Cale drove with a tense focus, his eyes scanning the terrain. The wastes weren't empty. Cathar drones, skeletal and insect-like, patrolled the perimeter of Sanctuary, their sensors sweeping for unauthorized departures. We navigated through a graveyard of decommissioned terraforming equipment, massive, rusted hulks that provided cover from the watchful eyes in the sky. It was during a brief stop to let the skitter's overtaxed engine cool that Cale finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air between us. Why, he asked, not looking at me, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You had it all. The clean air, the good food, the easy work. Why throw it all away? I told him about Wren and the Falcon, about the empty smile on his face after the recalibration. I tried to explain the suffocating feeling of the symbiote, the sensation of being a stranger in my own mind. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. They took his anger. I finished, my voice cracking. They took the thing that made him care. Cale was silent for a long moment. He picked up a reddish rock and turned it over in his hands. My mother was a botanist, he said quietly, before they came. She loved the weeds as much as the flowers, said they were survivors. The Cathar, they don't like survivors. They like gardeners. They pull up anything that doesn't grow in a neat little row. He tossed the rock aside. Everyone upstairs is a flower in a pot. Down here, we're weeds, growing in the cracks. Out there, he nodded towards the dark horizon. That's the rust. That's where they throw the weeds. They can't even be bothered to pull. We arrived at the rust at dawn. It was less a settlement and more a scar on the landscape. A sprawling shanty town built in the shadow of a colossal, defunct mining extractor. The buildings were cobbled together from scavenged ship hulls, sheets of corroded metal, and the plastic shells of old habitats. A pall of acrid smoke hung in the air from unfiltered power generators. This was not a place of noble rebellion. It was a place of exile. The people here were the uncalibratables, the cast-offs, the broken toys from Sanctuary's nursery. Their faces weren't placid, but they weren't alive with defiance either. They were sullen, gaunt, and empty in a different way from the citizens of the Spire. Their eyes held a deep, settled weariness. The look of people who had fought and lost so many times they had forgotten why they started. Their symbiotes were a constant source of irritation, like a phantom limb that still ached. They would twitch, their hands clenching for no reason, their expressions flickering with microbursts of garbled emotion, a flash of rage, followed by a numbing wave of pleasure, a spike of sorrow smoothed over into confusion. They were trapped in a state of perpetual emotional dissonance, their inner selves at war with the broken Cathar tech in their heads. They looked at our skitter with suspicion, at me with open hostility. A scribe, a part of the system that had discarded them. Kyle, at least, seemed to command a grudging respect. He was a known quantity, a trader of parts and information. He got us through the makeshift gate and led me to a central, open area that served as a marketplace. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and recycled protein paste. People bartered with salvaged tech and hoarded water rations. There was no community here, only a collection of individuals surviving in close proximity. This was not the army I had imagined. This was a refugee camp for the soul. I was a fool. I had thought that flipping a switch would be enough. I believed that if I could just show them what they had lost, they would rise up. But how do you restore fire to people who have been drenched in despair for a generation? I watched a man trade a perfectly good Hydra spanner for a small, chipped piece of blue glass. He held it up to the weak sun, his face slack with a kind of desperate awe. He wasn't looking for freedom. He was just looking for something, anything, to feel a flicker of beauty in his gray world. My despair was a cold weight in my stomach. Kyle saw it on my face. What did you expect? Scribe a welcome party, a revolution waiting for a leader. He gestured to the listless crowd. These people aren't fighters. They're the leftovers. But I still had the key. I hadn't come this far to give up. I needed to see what it would do here, in a place where the cage was already bent and broken. I spotted a woman sitting alone, sharpening a piece of scrap metal into a knife. Her face was a mask of grim concentration, but her hands trembled, a telltale sign of a symbiote fighting a losing battle against a stubborn mind. She was the one. Kyle grabbed my arm. Don't. You don't know what that thing will do to them. Their filters are already shot. I have to know, I whispered, pulling away. I walked towards her, my heart pounding. I activated the device, keeping the radius tight, just a few feet around her. The silent pulse washed over her. It wasn't like in the plaza. There was no sudden burst of weeping or shock. Instead, the woman went rigid. The knife fell from her hands with a clatter. Her head snapped up, and she looked at me. Her eyes, which had been dull and clouded, were suddenly blazing with a terrifying, lucid intensity. The trembling in her hand stopped. The sullen mask on her face didn't shatter. It burned away, revealing a core of pure, undiluted rage that had been festering within her for years. She didn't scream. She smiled, a sharp, predatory baring of teeth. You, she hissed, her voice like grinding stone. You woke me up. And then she began to laugh, a raw, powerful sound that cut through the market's dreary hum, turning every head in our direction. It wasn't the sound of joy. It was the sound of a chain breaking and a hungry animal finally being set loose. The woman's laughter was a lit fuse. It wasn't a sound of amusement. It was the raw, grating noise of a pressure valve screaming open after a lifetime of being sealed shut. Heads turned, not with the mild curiosity of the spire, but with the sharp, animal instinct of the hunted. The sullen, weary faces of the rust dwellers flickered with a mixture of fear and a dangerous and a forgotten recognition. Before the crowd could react, Kyle was on me, his hand clamping over my device, his body shielding me from the woman's burning gaze. "Turn it off," he hissed, his voice tight with a panic I hadn't heard before. I deactivated the frequency, and the effect was immediate. The lucid fire in the woman's eyes guttered and died, replaced by a profound, agonizing confusion. She looked down at her hands, then at me. her expression a mixture of terror and loss. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek before the broken symbiote in her head flooded her system with a jarring, inappropriate wave of pleasure. Her face went slack, the moment of clarity gone, leaving only the hollow ache of its absence. She scrambled back, crab-walking away from me as if I were a ghost, the sound of her own laughter still hanging in the air like a curse. The moment was broken, but the ripple remained. A low murmur spread through the marketplace. The people of the Rust were looking at me now, not as a scribe, but as something else, something unpredictable, something powerful. I had touched a nerve they thought had died long ago. An old man with a face like a dried riverbed and hands permanently stained with lubricant stepped forward. He was the closest thing the Rust had to a leader, a man they called Silas. "You bring a new kind of trouble here. Spire rat," he rasped, his voice heavy with the dust of the wastes. "We have an arrangement. We stay quiet. We keep the old machines running, and the Cathar leave us to rot in peace. You are not quiet. Your peace is a cage you've forgotten how to see." I retorted, my own voice surprising me with its strength. "I didn't come here to bring trouble. I came to remind you." Silas let out a dry, wheezing chuckle. "Remind us of what the earth we lost, the rage that got our parents and grandparents exiled here. We remember just fine. We just know it's a memory that will get you killed." He was right. In a way, the Rust was a monument to failed rebellions, but he was also wrong. Their memory wasn't a weapon. It was scar tissue, thick and numb. They remembered the pain, but they had forgotten the cause. My device hadn't just silenced the symbiote. It had bypassed the scar tissue and touched the raw, living nerve beneath. I had their attention, but it was the attention of a wounded beast, unsure whether to flee or to attack. That night, Kyle took me to his own hovel, a cramped space carved out of the base of the great mining extractor. It was a fortress of scavenged parts. The door a repurposed airlock secured with a complex series of manual bolts. "Silas is right," he said, his back to me as he worked on the skitter's damaged treads. "They'll trade you to the Cathar for a week's worth of clean water. You showed them something they can't have, and that makes you dangerous." "What I showed them is that they're not broken," I argued, watching his deft hands manipulate wires and servos. "They're just dormant. There's a difference between being dormant and being dead." "Ilara," he said, finally turning to face me. The flickering light of his work lamp cast deep shadows across his face. "You woke that woman up. For 5 seconds. She was free. And what did she feel? Joy, hope? No. She felt a rage so pure, it nearly broke her. You think you're handing out a cure, but this place is a powder keg. Your cure is a lit match." His words stung because they were true. I had been arrogant, a scribe who thought she could edit reality as easily as she redacted a text. I had the key, but I had no idea what lock it truly opened, or what lay behind the door. The next few days were a tense standoff. I was an outcast within a community of outcasts. The people of the Rust watched me with a mixture of fear and a hungry, desperate curiosity. They gave me a wide berth, but their eyes followed me everywhere. I saw them talking in hushed groups, glancing in my direction. I saw the woman I had awakened sitting by herself at the edge of the settlement, staring out at the red desert, her hands periodically clenching and unclenching. I had shown her a glimpse of her own soul, and now she was haunted by it. The change came in the form of a dust storm, a massive, swirling wall of red that descended on the rust with a furious howl. These storms were a fact of life on the untamed Mars, capable of stripping paint from metal and flesh from bone. The settlement battened down, sealing makeshift doors and reinforcing flimsy walls. For 3 days, the world outside was an impenetrable curtain of wind and sand. On the second day of the storm, the main power generator for the settlement's water recyclers failed. It wasn't a Cathar system. It was an ancient, pre-contact piece of human engineering that the exiles kept running through sheer ingenuity and cannibalized parts. Now, it was silent, and with it, the slow, steady drip of recycled water that kept them all alive. Panic, a raw, primal emotion that even the broken symbiotes couldn't suppress, began to spread. Silas and his crew of mechanics worked frantically, but the generator was a complex beast, and the failing component was buried deep in its core. "The primary capacitor is shot," Silas announced, his voice grim, wiping a layer of grime and sweat from his forehead. "We don't have a replacement. We can't build one. In 2 days, the reserve tanks will be empty." The news rippled through the sheltered community, and the fragile peace shattered. Fights broke out over hoarded water rations. The weary despair of the rust dwellers curdled into a vicious, desperate fear. This was the end, and they knew it. It was Kale who came to me. "The schematics," he said, his eyes intense. "You have access to the Spire's archives. Is there anything in there? Anything about this model of generator?" An idea sparked in my mind. A desperate gamble. I hadn't just been a redactor. My scribe training was comprehensive. I knew the archival systems inside and out. "Maybe," I said. "But I'll need a stable connection to the Spire's network. And I'll need power." We used the last of the skitter's energy cells to power Kale's console. While the storm raged outside, I plunged back into the digital world I had fled. My master codes, a ghost in the system, still worked. I dove deep into the historical archives, past the redacted poetry and sanitized histories, into the technical records of Earth's expansion into the solar system. The Cathar hadn't bothered to redact these. They were relics of a dead era, irrelevant to their project of cultural cleansing. I found it buried in a subfile for Martian colonization efforts, detailed schematics for the Cinder-class terraforming generator, the very machine that was now silent. But the schematics weren't enough. The capacitor was a bespoke piece of equipment, its manufacturing process lost to time. But as I scanned the ancillary files, I found something else: the engineer's personal logs. His name was Kenji Tanaka, and his entries were filled not just with technical data, but with his frustrations, his breakthroughs, and his passion for his creation. He wrote about the machine as if it were a living thing, with a heart and a soul. And in the final entry, I found it. A hidden note. "If the main cap ever blows, and you don't have a replacement, you can create a bypass loop. It's an unstable, temporary fix, but it will work. You just need to reroute the secondary plasma conduits through the induction housing. The trick is the frequency. You have to harmonize the plasma flow, or it will overload the entire system. The resonant frequency is..." The rest of the entry was corrupted, a string of garbled data. The key was lost. My heart sank. We were so close. I stared at the corrupted data. The ghost of a solution. "The trick is the frequency." The words echoed in my mind. intertwining with the memory of the waveform I had found, the cryptic message hidden in the poem. The key is not a word, but the silence between the notes. It couldn't be. It was an insane leap of logic, a desperate connection born of hope and fear. But what if the waveform wasn't a weapon against the symbiote? What if that was just a side effect? What if its primary purpose was something else entirely? Kyle, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I need to connect my device to your console. I think I have the frequency. He looked at me as if I were mad, but the desperation in my eyes must have convinced him. We interfaced my crude device with his sophisticated rig. I loaded the waveform, the coiled serpent of light and sound. The generator was in the heart of the settlement, a massive, silent behemoth. Silas and his crew had already exposed the core, the tangled guts of the machine. They watched with open skepticism as I, a scribe who had never held a tool in her life, directed Kale to rig a bypass according to the schematics I'd recovered. This is suicide, Silas grunted. You fire up the plasma flow without a regulator, and this whole place will go up in a fireball. Just get it ready, I said, my focus absolute. The final connection was made. The settlement held its breath. The only sounds were the howling of the storm and the frantic beating of my own heart. Now, I told Kyle. He engaged the primary power. A deep hum started, rising in pitch as plasma began to flow through the temporary conduits. On the console, warning lights flashed red. A high-pitched whine filled the air, the sound of a system about to tear itself apart. It's going to overload, Silas shouted. Shut it down, wait. I commanded. I looked at the waveform on my slate, the pattern of light and sound. I took a breath and broadcast it, not at the people, but into the heart of the machine itself, feeding the frequency directly into the surging plasma stream. For a terrible second, the whine intensified, the hum rising to a deafening shriek. Then, something miraculous happened. The shriek subsided, the chaotic frequency of the plasma aligning, harmonizing with the waveform I had introduced. The violent vibration smoothed out. The red warning lights flickered and turned green. The deep, steady thrum of a healthy power core filled the silence. A cheer went up from the assembled mechanics. A raw, explosive sound of pure relief. A few minutes later, the lights in the settlement flickered back on, and the reassuring hum of the water recyclers started once more. We had done it. We had saved them. I stood there, leaning against the console, drained but exhilarated. I had used my key, not to break a mind, but to mend a machine. Silas approached me, his old, cynical face etched with a look of grudging awe. He looked at the humming generator, then at me. What was that frequency, he asked. Where did you get it? It's a song, I said, the truth of it finally dawning on me. An old one. From Earth. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The waveform wasn't a weapon. It was a tool, a piece of forgotten human science. It resonated with the symbiote because the Cathar had built their technology on the ruins of our own. The symbiote was a perversion of something we had created, and this frequency was its original tuning key, a master command that could, it seemed, not just disrupt, but also harmonize. The storm broke the next morning, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a world that felt new. The people of the Rust looked at me differently now. I wasn't just the harbinger of chaos. I was the woman who had brought back the water. I had earned my place, but my discovery had opened up 1,000 new questions. Who had created this frequency, and why hide it in a poem? What else had we forgotten that evening? The woman who had laughed, whose name I learned was Mara, came to my hovel. She didn't speak. She just handed me a small object. It was a bird, crudely carved from a piece of reddish stone. Its wings were spread, its head tilted as if listening to the wind. A falcon. I remembered. She said, her voice rough but steady. After the water came back, I remembered making things with my hands. She wasn't smiling. Not yet, but the terrible, burning rage in her eyes had been replaced by a slow, simmering ember of purpose. I had given them back their water, but in the process, I had also given them back a piece of their humanity. And I was beginning to understand that the two were inextricably linked. Freedom wasn't just about breaking the chains. It was about remembering how to build, how to create, how to sing the songs that made the machines and our own hearts run true. The aftermath of the storm settled over the rust, not as peace, but as a profound and unsettling shift in the atmospheric pressure of our small, broken world. The water flowed, a constant, reassuring hum from the mended generator that became the new heartbeat of the settlement. But with survival assured, the questions I had unearthed began to surface. I was no longer an object of fear, but of a cautious, almost reverent curiosity. People would bring me their broken tech malfunctioning hydroponic lamps, sputtering communication relays, jury-rigged heaters as if I were some kind of tech priestess. They didn't understand the frequency, and neither did I. Not really. All they knew was that my song had healed the machine that kept them alive. Using Kale's console and the remaining power from the skitter, I began to experiment. I found that by modulating the waveform, I could achieve different effects. A slight shift in amplitude could coax a dying power cell back to life. A change in the oscillation could clear the static from a long-range comms unit, allowing us to hear the faint, ghostly whispers of Cathar traffic for the first time. The frequency wasn't just a key, it was a language, a form of programming that operated on a level far more fundamental than binary code. It spoke directly to the quantum architecture of the technology, both human and Cathar. It was science that bordered on magic. My most significant breakthrough came when I turned the frequency back on the people. But this time, not as a weapon. I adjusted the waveform, softening it, shaping it into something gentle. Not a disruptive blast, but a continuous, low-energy hum. I tested it on myself first. The effect was startling. The frantic, pleasure-pain signals from my symbiote didn't vanish. They clarified. I could feel the alien tech in my brainstem, a distinct and separate presence. But I could also feel my own undiluted emotions, my own thoughts, running in a parallel channel. The hum of my device was acting as a filter, a shield, allowing me to see the bars of my cage without being controlled by them. I could feel the Kethar's sweet poison, but I no longer had to drink it. Kyle was my first volunteer. He sat across from me in his hovel, his face a mask of nervous tension. When I activated the modified frequency, he flinched. His eyes closed, and his hands clenched into fists. I can feel it. He breathed, his voice tight. Everything. All at once, for the first time since childhood, he was experiencing his own mind without the Cathar's emotional anesthetic. The grief for his mother, the years of repressed anger at their placid conquerors, the constant, grinding fear of his life in the underbelly, it all came rushing back. It was a deluge, and he was drowning. But he didn't break. He weathered the storm, and when he opened his eyes again, they were clear. The restless, hunted look was gone, replaced by a steely, focused calm. "The weeds," he whispered, a slow smile spreading across his face. "They never died. They were just waiting for the rain." We began to build what we called shields, small, personal devices that emitted the harmonizing frequency. They were crude, cobbled together from scavenged parts, with a battery life of only a few hours. But they were the most precious things in the rust. For the first time, people could choose to be free. They could turn on the shield and feel the full, painful, while glorious spectrum of their own humanity. They could remember who they were, grieve for what they had lost, and feel the clean, sharp blade of anger for what had been done to them. Mara, the woman who had laughed, was transformed. With the shield active, her simmering rage became a focused, creative energy. Her hands, no longer trembling, became instruments of art and function. She began to organize the rust, her voice cutting through the years of apathy. She set up work crews to reinforce the settlement's defenses, established a fair system for rationing, and began training a small militia, teaching them to fight with scavenged tools and sharpened scrap. The carvings she made falcons, wolves, figures from a forgotten Earth mythology became symbols of their reawakening. Silas, the old mechanic, became our chief engineer. The frequency seemed to unlock something in his mind, giving him an intuitive understanding of the old technologies. He began to repair and improve systems that had been failing for years, his cynicism replaced by a grumpy, tireless dedication. The rust was no longer a scrap heap of broken people. It was becoming a community, a fortress, a home. Our growing strength did not go unnoticed. Our renewed activity, the repairs to our systems, the faint energy signature of my experiments, it all registered as a tiny, anomalous blip on the Cathar's immaculate grid. One evening, as I was fine-tuning the frequency on the main comms unit, I broke through a layer of Cathar encryption. What came through was not a chime-like voice, but a stream of pure data, a Cathar internal report. I translated it with Kael, looking over my shoulder, his breath catching as the words formed on the screen. Anomaly detected Sector 7G. Designate the rust. Unscheduled energy fluctuations consistent with pre-contact human technology. Emotional dissonance levels among local population have stabilized, indicating a potential rogue symbiote modification. Hypothesis: a historical contagion has resurfaced. Recommend immediate deployment of a curator unit for assessment and sterilization. Sterilization. The word was cold, clinical, and absolute. They weren't sending peacekeepers to recalibrate us. They were sending a curator, a being I only knew from redacted historical files. A curator wasn't a soldier or a cop. It was an exterminator, a gardener sent to deal with a particularly stubborn patch of weeds by salting the earth. We had days, maybe a week, before it arrived. The news spread through the settlement like a shockwave. Fear, raw and potent, was the first reaction. Many wanted to scatter, to run back into the shadows and hope the Cathar overlooked them. But Mara's voice cut through the panic. "We have spent our lives running," she roared, standing on a pile of scrap metal in the center of the marketplace, a stone falcon in her hand. "They exiled us here to die, and we refused. They left us to thirst, And we brought back the water. Now they send a monster to finish the job. I say we show this curator what happens when you try to burn a field of weeds that has learned to fight back her words, backed by the clear-eyed conviction of her own unshackled mind, ignited the embers of defiance in the crowd. They had tasted freedom, however briefly. They were not going to give it up without a fight. The rust transformed into a hive of frantic activity. Under Mara's command and Silas's engineering genius, we turned our home into a trap. We used my knowledge of the Spire systems and Kale's understanding of the Cathar's patrol patterns to our advantage. We were the ghosts in their machine, and we would use their own perfection against them. My role was central. The frequency was our only true weapon, while Silas and his team worked on the hardware, rigging the old mining extractor with massive electromagnets, turning scrap metal into makeshift cannons, and creating a network of high-energy emitters throughout the settlement. I worked on the software. I had to turn my song of harmony into a weapon of war. I spent every waking hour at Kale's console, pushing the waveform to its limits, searching for a dissonant chord, a disruptive frequency that could do more than just confuse a symbiote. I needed something that could cripple Cathar technology itself. I found it in the logs of Kenji Tanaka, the engineer who had designed the generator. Buried in his personal notes was a theoretical discussion on the dangers of resonant cascade failure. He hypothesized that if you could find the precise resonant frequency of a crystalline-based power system and hit it with a matching, amplified signal, you could cause a feedback loop that would shatter the system from the inside out. It was a weapon of incredible power, and it was exactly how Cathar technology, from their ships to their peacekeepers, was powered. The day the curator arrived, the sky was a placid, cloudless red. It didn't descend in a warship. It came in one of the polished Riverstone vessels, the same kind that had first arrived at Earth. The ship hung in the sky above us, impossibly silent, a symbol of the serene, suffocating power we were about to defy. We were all wearing shields, our minds clear, our hearts pounding with a terrifying, exhilarating cocktail of fear and resolve. From the ship, a single figure descended on a column of shimmering light. The curator was not a hulking monster. It was tall and slender like all Cathar, but it was clad in segmented, iridescent armor that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury. It held no weapon. It didn't need one. Its very presence was a weapon, projecting an aura of absolute authority and calm that was 1,000 times more potent than a peacekeeper's pacification field. Even with our shields, we could feel the pressure, a psychic weight that demanded submission. The curator landed softly in the center of the marketplace. It surveyed our shabby settlement, its large, black eyes taking in our makeshift barricades and determined faces. The familiar chimes echoed, not just in our heads, but in the air itself, a sound that was both beautiful and utterly chilling. This colony has developed a severe cultural infection. The curator chimed, its voice a symphony of paternalistic disappointment. The historical pathologies of aggression, disharmony, and irrational creativity have been allowed to fester. A cleansing is required for the health of the whole. It raised one of its 3-fingered hands, and the armor on its arm began to glow with a soft, white light. It was preparing to unleash the sterilization field, to erase us from existence with a gentle, silent wave of energy. Now I screamed into the comms. Silas slammed his hand down on a large, red button. The ground beneath the curator erupted. It wasn't an explosion of fire and shrapnel, but a blast of pure magnetic force. The ancient mining extractor, supercharged and focused, fired a massive electromagnetic pulse directly at the curator. The being was thrown backward, its iridescent armor flickering as the pulse washed over it. Its psychic pressure wavered for a moment. And in that moment, Mara and her fighters attacked. They swarmed from their hiding places, armed with sharpened metal pikes and rivet guns, their battle cries raw and human. At the same time, from my position at the console, I unleashed my own weapon. I broadcast the resonant cascade frequency, amplified through every emitter in the settlement, aimed directly at the curator's ship hanging in the sky. The effect was catastrophic. A high-pitched scream tore through the air as the ship's crystalline power core began to resonate with my signal. Cracks of light spiderwebbed across its smooth, dark hull. It shuddered violently. Then, with a silent, blinding flash, it shattered into a million pieces, a glittering rain of dead technology falling from the sky. Down below, the curator was faltering. The EMP had disrupted its personal energy field, and the destruction of its ship seemed to have severed its connection to the Cathar network. For the first time, it looked not like a god, but like a soldier, cut off and alone. It fought with a terrifying, balletic grace, its armor deflecting blows, its hands lashing out with focused kinetic energy that could send a person flying. But it was outnumbered. Kyle, fighting with a desperate ferocity I never knew he possessed, managed to jam a sharpened pipe into a joint in the curator's armor. The being let out a chime that was not a word, but a pure expression of pain. It stumbled, and Mara was there. She drove her pike into the weak point Kyle had created, putting her entire weight behind the blow. The curator went down, its iridescent armor flickering and dying. It lay on the red dust of our home, a fallen angel of a false paradise. We had done the impossible. We had killed a god. We stood there, breathing heavily, covered in dust and sweat, looking at the dead curator and the glittering debris of its ship raining down around us. We hadn't just survived. We had won. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new, colder reality set in. We had not just swatted a fly. We had declared war on the zookeeper. The Cathar would know what happened here. They would know about the frequency. And they would no longer send a single curator. They would send an army. Our victory was not an ending. It was the beginning of a whole new kind of fight. The silence that fell after the curator's death was heavier than the storm had been. It was the silence of a finish line that was also a starting gun. We had won a battle, a spectacular, impossible battle, but in doing so, we had kicked the hornet's nest of the galaxy. The glittering debris of the Cathar ship was still falling, catching the weak sunlight like a shower of black diamonds, each one a harbinger of the retribution to come. The initial euphoria of victory quickly evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard calculus of our new reality. We were a tiny, isolated settlement of a few hundred exiles on a forgotten planet, and we had just openly declared war on the serene, monolithic power that controlled the entire system. Kyle was the first to voice it. "They know," he said, his voice flat as he stared at the dead curator, its elegant form looking strangely fragile in the red dust. They felt the ship die. They felt him die. They know we have a weapon that can hurt them. He was right. The Cathar network was instantaneous. Our secret was out. The question wasn't if they would retaliate, but how, and how soon. A council of war was held in the shadow of the now silent generator, the machine that had first saved us. It consisted of me, the reluctant scribe-turned-scientist, Kyle, the scavenger who had become our strategist, Mara, the artist who had forged our rage into a weapon, and Silas, the old cynic who had rediscovered his faith in the power of human ingenuity. The mood was grim. We had the frequency, a weapon the Cathar had never anticipated, but they had numbers, resources, and control of the entire orbital infrastructure. "We can't win a defensive war," Mara stated, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the despair. "They'll simply bombard us from orbit until the rust is a crater. We fought a battle of surprise. We won't get that advantage again." "She's right," Silas grunted, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Our trap worked once. Next time, they'll come with shields hardened against EMPs and weapons that can level this place from beyond the horizon." The conversation circled this grim truth for an hour. We were trapped. Then, I looked at Kale's console, where the translated Cathar report was still displayed on the screen. A historical contagion has resurfaced. They saw us not as an army, but as a disease. An idea, cold and audacious, began to form in my mind. "They're right," I said quietly, and all eyes turned to me. "We are a contagion, so let's not act like an army. Let's act like a plague." I explained my plan. We couldn't fight their fleet. We couldn't defend the rust. So we wouldn't. We would abandon it. We would take our weapon, the frequency, the knowledge of how to build the shields, and we would spread it. Our target wouldn't be their ships. It would be their foundation, the silent, compliant human population of Sanctuary. We would not raise an army to fight the Cathar. We would wake up their workforce, their servants, their placid, smiling slaves. We would turn their greatest asset into their greatest threat. The plan was insane. It meant leaving our home, everything we had just fought to protect, and splitting up, becoming ghosts once more. But it was the only plan that offered a glimmer of hope. We would take the fight to them, not on a battlefield, but in the minds of every human under their control. Our last days in the rust were a blur of frantic preparation. Silas and his team worked around the clock to build dozens of the personal shield devices and 3 powerful, long-range broadcast units. Kyle stripped the skidder and other scavenged vehicles for parts, creating smaller, faster skimmers designed for stealth. Mara trained a small, elite cadre of fighters, not for open combat, but for infiltration and sabotage. My job was the most crucial. I had to distill my discovery into something that could be easily replicated. I couldn't be everywhere at once. I encoded the waveform and the instructions for building the shield devices onto hundreds of small, encrypted data chips. The final piece of the puzzle was our escape. The Cathar controlled the skies. We couldn't fly out. We had to go under. Using the old Spire schematics I still possessed, we located a network of ancient, sealed lava tubes, part of Mars's original, failed terraforming infrastructure that ran for hundreds of miles beneath the surface. One of them, according to the charts, passed directly beneath the foundations of the Ivory Spire itself. It was our way in. We left the rust under the cover of a moonless night. A small exodus of 20 souls, the rest of the inhabitants scattering into the wastes in small groups, a diaspora of defiance carrying our memory and the hope of our return. We left the generator running, a beacon of false life, to delay the Cathar's discovery of our departure. Our journey through the lava tubes was a descent into a silent, timeless darkness. The air was thin and cold, and the only sounds were the hum of our skimmers and our own ragged breathing. For weeks, we traveled through this subterranean world, navigating by the ghostly light of the spire, schematics projected from my data slate. We were miners, tunneling not for ore, but for freedom. We emerged into the service levels at the base of the Ivory Spire, the place where Kyle and I had first begun our desperate flight. It felt like a lifetime ago. The Spire was on high alert. Cathar peacekeeper patrols were doubled, their blue lights sweeping the corridors with a new, heightened paranoia. The search for the contagion was in full swing. We were 3 small teams. Mara's team would target the main communications array at the apex of the spire to broadcast my frequency to the entire planet. Kale's team would sabotage the primary transport nexuses, creating chaos and preventing the Cathar from moving their forces effectively. My team, just me and Silas, had the most important and dangerous job. We had to plant the main broadcaster at the central power core of the spire itself, the heart of the entire city. From there, the frequency would be carried on the energy grid to every home, every terminal, every symbiote in Sanctuary. The infiltration was a masterpiece of stealth and timing, orchestrated by Kyle using the Spire's own security network, which he accessed with my old codes. We moved like whispers through the bowels of the machine, a virus entering the bloodstream of our enemy. When we reached the power core chamber, I was struck by a profound sense of cosmic irony. It was a vast, cathedral-like space, and in its center, suspended in a web of magnetic fields, was a glowing, crystalline sphere, a larger, more perfect version of the core I had seen shatter in the curator's ship. The Cathar hadn't just conquered us. They had built their paradise directly on top of our old technology. The generator in the rust and this power core were distant cousins, born from the same forgotten human science. While Silas worked frantically to interface our broadcast unit with the core's energy conduits, I stood watch, my own personal shield humming, my mind clear, my heart a steady drum. I could feel the moment the other team succeeded. A new, faint vibration began to run through the floor plates of the spire. Mara had seized the comms array. A moment later, distant, muffled explosions told me Kyle had crippled the transport hubs. Alarms began to blare throughout the spire, no longer gentle chimes, but harsh, panicked shrieks. It was time. It's ready. Silas grunted, stepping back from the broadcast unit, his face lit by its green status light. I took a deep breath, looked at the schematics for the human mind that the Cathar had so arrogantly designed, and I broadcast my song. Not the gentle, harmonizing hum of the shields, nor the shattering shriek that had destroyed the ship. This was something new, a frequency designed to do one thing: awaken. I felt it through the floor, a psychic shock wave that expanded from the core and shot through the entire structure of the spire. I imagined it spreading across the city, a silent, invisible tsunami of consciousness. For a few seconds, there was an unearthly silence, and then the screaming began. It was not the sound of a few dozen people in a plaza. It was the sound of 1,000,000 souls waking up from a long, placid dream into a nightmare of their own making. It was the collective, agonized roar of a species remembering its own name. The cage of bliss had shattered, and the raw, unfiltered emotions of 1,000,000 people, suppressed for generations, were unleashed all at once. The Ivory Spire, that monument to tranquil perfection, became a tower of beautiful, terrible chaos. We heard it on the comms as we made our escape, the sounds of people tearing the implements of their oppression from the walls, the sounds of Cathar peacekeepers being overwhelmed by sheer numbers, the sound of human voices raised in anger and grief and a wild, terrifying joy for the first time in a century. We didn't stay to watch the outcome. Our mission was complete. The plague had been released. We made it back to the lava tubes and out into the red desert, emerging under a sky where the stars were no longer cold and distant, but looked like campfires, promising warmth and a new beginning. We didn't know if humanity would win. We didn't know if they would destroy themselves with their newfound, untamed emotions. But we knew that for the first time in 100 years, they had a choice. We had not given them victory. We had given them a fight. Years later, from a hidden settlement deep in the canyons of the Great Mariner Valley, we would watch the signals from the Ivory Spire. The war was long and brutal. The Cathar did not surrender their garden easily, but they were fighting an enemy they could no longer comprehend. They could not recalibrate a whole population. They could not reason with a species that had rediscovered its own chaotic, passionate, and indomitable soul. We saw the lights of Cathar ships falling from the sky, not from our weapons, but from the sabotage of their own human crews. We heard the old songs of Earth, broadcast on open frequencies, sung by 1,000,000 defiant voices. I never returned to the spire. My war was over. I had been a scribe, tasked with erasing the past. But in the end, my greatest act was to give it back. I would spend the rest of my days not redacting, but writing, chronicling the story of our long slumber and our savage, beautiful awakening. My name is Elara, and I learned that the dust of old Earth was not a sin. It was a seed, and in the thin, red soil of Mars, it had finally, defiantly, begun to grow.